Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webcast on why does psychological safety matter in banking and what can we do about it. My name is Anna Young from the Chartered Banker Institute today, and I am delighted to introduce Abby Freeman of Brink and her guest Nicole Brigandi, who are with us today to provide an overview of psychological safety and what it means for your organisation. We have invited them to share their expertise from banking and beyond with you today. Before I pass over, if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the online function to submit these, and Abby and Nicole will do their best to answer all of the questions that you have. You can also access relevant attachments that Abby and Nicole have provided, and please also participate in the interactive polls by just clicking on the answers when the poll pops up. I will now pass over to Abby and Nicole to introduce themselves.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Abby Freeman from Brink, and I'm an organisational psychologist. At Brink, we work with global corporates and with governments, so typically highly regulated organisations, and we work with them on their invention, their reinvention, their venturing. So that essentially means we help organisations cultivate the mindsets and the skill sets they need to be innovative. And we work a lot on cultures as well. So we work on creating a culture that promotes learning and experimentation, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And with banking and financial services, we often have a conversation, something along the lines of what is the future of our sector or our organisation, and what can we start to do about it today. I'm really looking forward to spending this hour with you, and I'm very pleased to introduce my guest for the session as well, Nicole Brigandi.
Hi, everyone, and thanks to Abby. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm a leadership coach and organizational psychologist. I come from professional services initially and now work independently with organizations, with individuals, and with teams to be able to develop more conscious leaders and more conscious business, and ultimately in an effort to promote healthy behavior in the workplace. Well, I've worked across all sectors, all industries, in several different countries in the world. Recently, I was actually working with the FCA and getting to know a lot more about the financial service industry, and we published a discussion paper on transforming culture in financial services, which was followed by a deeper dive exploration into the topic we're talking about today, psychological safety.
Thanks, Nicole. So I hope you can see why I feel Nicole is a good guest to be joining us for the session today. So you'll see these are our contact details, and as we go through, there are separate links to resources on the side. So feel free to tweet at us or send us an email after the session, and you can access our contact details and the resources. So that's a little bit about us. We've seen who we have online from the list of attendees when you registered, but it would be really useful for Nicole and I to understand what divisions you work in your organisation as well. So I'm going to launch a poll now, and you'll have about 60 seconds to reply to that. As I said, it would just be very helpful for us to understand who is in the webinar. So you'll see the poll on your screen, and yeah, please let us know. But while that's happening, I'll carry on. And this is what we're going to spend our time on today. It's a rough agenda. As we go through, please send us any questions that you have. And if we know that we're going to be addressing them, then we'll park them. But if it's a question that's not something we're planning to address, then we will be sure to make time at the end to answer your questions. So we're going to talk a little bit about what psychological safety actually is and why does it matter now. Then we'll look at where's the evidence, so that's more from stories and case studies than necessarily getting too much into the science. And we'll talk about the benefits, so why is it important and why do we need to be thinking about it. Then we'll look at how do you actually do this, how do you make the untangible tangible, and we'll give you some very practical tips and techniques. And then we'll look at what you can do next, so directly after our hour together today, what can you start doing in your teams and your organizations today. Then, as I said, we'll wrap up with the Q&A. We'll see how we're doing for time at that point, but we're aiming to leave some time for Q&A at the end. So that's great. Thank you for taking time to answer the poll. That's really useful to see. And we see that we've got quite a mix from some compliance, some HR, nearly 20% customer facing, a good amount from legal, and then others as well. So thank you for doing that.
Great. So psychological safety, what is it? We won't do polls throughout the whole thing, but we are going to launch another poll now just at the bottom of the screen to get a better sense of how aware you are of this topic, how much you've attempted to put it into practice already. So I'll carry on, but if you wouldn't mind just indulging us in one more poll, that would be wonderful. So for those of you who haven't heard of this before, or maybe just aren't sure, so psychological safety describes a group environment where individuals are not hindered by interpersonal fear. Team members aren't afraid to speak up, they're not afraid to take risks when it comes to raising any concerns or sharing ideas, and you'll find that leaders and peers in a team with high psychological safety also have the courage to listen to perspectives that differ from their own. So the person who coined this term, which you'll see there, is Amy Edmondson, who's been a professor at Harvard for many years. And over the past, about 20 years ago, she coined this term while she was doing her research on teaming. And this, I guess you could say, is kind of a sliver of the full story of culture, which we'll also kind of talk about in tandem. So let me just have a quick look at the poll. Okay, so we're still going. So it looks like we're everywhere from never heard of it before to I've heard the term vaguely, what is it even doing in this, in the business world, to some people have actually started to start using this and start doing things in the organization. We're going to try and use this time to bring to light lots of different examples, so hopefully that'll be useful for you, whatever your role and whatever kind of starting point that you're at right now with this term.
So why are we talking about this now? You know, why have we been invited to do this, host this webinar today, and what's going on in the sector that it is becoming more known about and more talked about? There's a few things going on, a few drivers actually. Many of you probably will have seen Larry Fink's letter from BlackRock, who was essentially saying leaders need to step up, and this is a theme we're going to see. And there's a wider kind of macro thing going on here, which is the traditional economic model is set up for certainty and plans, and we see that often in organizational structures and styles of leadership as well. But we're in much more complex and uncertain times now. So Brexit in the UK is on many people's minds, but generally, globally, things are moving much faster now that require new ways of being adaptive and working together as teams. So that's a big factor in why it's coming onto the agenda. And industry is talking about culture for over a decade, but it's only really now we have the means to understand what it means in business and the role it plays, and we have new ways to measure it too. So those are some of the reasons why it's firmly on the agenda. And some of you may have heard the CBI webinar on a more general topic of culture and conduct by Ruth Steinholtz a few weeks ago. And she made the point that culture is the responsibility of everybody. And that's very fitting for what we're talking about today as well. So a final factor for those of you in the UK, a bit of background, is that the recent update in the UK's corporate governance code highlights the importance of a healthy culture in delivering long-term sustainable performance and trust in business. And now, according to the update to the code earlier this year, the board now is expected to lead by example and promote the desired culture. And even the chair has a role to promote a culture of openness and debate. So, you know, these soft, more intangible things are beginning to be hard-baked into how we tackle governance in our organizations.
Yeah, and the other examples we've got there, so no matter what your view is on the regulator, and you know, most of you, from what we could see from the registration list, are working in the sector now, and so you'll know that, you know, the regulator does have quite a big influence, and I've seen some of you are coming from compliance as well, so you'll be very well versed, likely with FDA policies. When it comes to culture, basically, they view culture as a widely accepted root cause of some of the major conduct failings that we've seen over the past several years. This ultimately has a knock-on impact, causing harm to consumers and harm to markets. So it's not really a surprise that culture and governance has been a cross-sector priority for the FCA over the past few years, and that will continue this year as well. So in addition to the discussion paper, which you can find a link to in resources, that brings to light 28 different essay perspectives from other international regulators and academics and change practitioners, and also some of your peers who are in the industry. In addition to that, they have ongoing opportunities to try and encourage and engage debate around the drivers of culture and what this is about for firms, and also what this means for the role of the regulator. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, they do believe that firms have an accountability for their own culture, and that's quite a big responsibility and a complex one to try and understand. And finally, we've got the Banking Standards Board. So some of you may be familiar, and if you're not, I encourage you to check out their website, also a link in the resources. They've developed an assessment framework that's been going for about 3 years now, if I'm not mistaken, which looks at 9 different characteristics of culture through an employee survey. And they're trying to get a sense of outcomes for the consumer, for clients, for employees, and beyond in the work that they do. Some key things to kind of point out here is the findings that they've gathered over the past several years. They've included kind of 3 main areas. Importance of leading by example. So Abby already mentioned that, and it's almost impossible to not have some of those examples come through. We'll touch on that later. The importance of employee health and well-being, which is an area for continued improvement in the sector. And then most relevant to our discussion is the reluctance to speak out as a consequence of what they found to be fear and futility. They've got an upcoming assessment coming out. The results for that will come out next month, which I definitely keep an eye out for, as they've added some more questions to dig into this exact topic. So obviously this is relevant, and we'll now build on what that actually means. How does psychological safety fit into that? So we've been gifted this term in business that doesn't exactly fit very comfortably. And I'll tell you just a quick story of where it's come from. So while academics have been studying constructs like this for a long time, not just in culture, but also elements relating to teaming and psychological safety and learning, it wasn't until Google set out back in 2012 actually to disprove that managers were actually a needed part of organizations. So they set out to say, actually, I don't think we need managers, but let's try and prove the case both ways. They found managers were incredibly important, and as a result have done loads of work in the frameworks that they use day to day and quarter to quarter. So from there they said, well, if managers are important, then what makes a good team? So researcher Julia Rosowski, she led a project called Project Aristotle, which many of you may have heard about. And the whole idea is that this project has encapsulated this phrase that we all know of, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So they conducted this research over a 2-year period. They looked at over 180 active teams. They did more than 200 interviews of Googlers, their employees, and looked at loads of different attributes. So they were trying to figure out, is this about personality? Is this about certain background? They looked at everything. And what they found, you can see clearly here, is that psychological safety was the strongest predictor of high-performing teams than any other factor in this list even. So essentially what we're saying here is who is on a team matters matters less than how the team actually interacts. So we previously tried to recruit A players, right? We want top candidates. But what they found is basically, even if you have all the best talent on one team, if they can't get it together to communicate and work together and share ideas, they're pretty much going to get outperformed every single time by a team of maybe lower performers. So that's where this has come from. And ultimately, just to dig a little further and to bring some of the literature to life for you. So why this matters for organizations. Along with this trend of what Google found, like I said, the academics have been switched on to this for over 60 years. And what we're seeing now with the rapid pace of change and ever complex business dynamics, what the management literature shows, as well as the organizational psychology literature, is that team effectiveness has become critical for organizational performance. And since organizations are living systems, they're constantly evolving and regenerating. No organization is immune to this. No organization is without its flaws. So all are required to adopt a curiosity about teamwork and collaboration if they're going to be expected to enable an environment of performance and creativity and innovation and safety. So ultimately, firms who underestimate this importance of teams and the dynamics of teams are at a huge disadvantage to their competitors. And what psychological safety is about is creating the environment to optimize learning and teamwork.
So knowing all this and starting to dig into what it actually means, where's the evidence? And we brought together today 3 stories to illustrate the point. We've taken a bit of a broad sweep across sectors because no organization or sector is immune. And we like to think of psychological safety a little bit like oxygen sometimes. It can be hard to spot, but we know when it's not present. And a common strand through companies that don't operate well or that have major compliance issues, the high-profile, high-press stories, typically when things don't go well for them, we find out later that psychological safety was not present. So these are the examples that we're going to bring to you first, is how do you know what happens when it's not present? And so we'll start with Wells Fargo because this is likely a story that you know well. Wells Fargo famously set goals that were aggressive, audacious, and they put in place incentive schemes to motivate teams to hit those targets. And that's not an issue. We all have targets in our work, and sometimes they can be very, very healthy and helpful. The challenge with Wells Fargo was, the point was no one could challenge those targets. And it began to force really unethical behavior in people who are normally good people. And we later heard that employees ended up doing things they wouldn't normally have done because of the incentive structure and the pressure and the fear inside that organization. So what happened inside Wells Fargo was it turned out people were opening fake accounts to hit their targets, or worse, they were opening accounts, unauthorized accounts, on behalf of their customers to hit their targets. And at one point, it was found that 3.5 million accounts had been opened that were sort of false. So when it got investigated, there was a fines and there was fires, and this time last year, it was hit with one of the harshest punishments ever handed down by the Federal Reserve, I recently heard. And it turned out that actually some employees had reported the unethical behavior to their managers and even some to the CEO, but they were fired for speaking up. So the point here is that aggressive target setting in and of itself isn't a problem. But with it, if you're setting a culture of zero challenge, anyone that challenges is fired. There's high stress, and instead of speaking up, everyone learns that they have to sort of keep quiet and bend the rules and perhaps become unethical. The message that Wells Fargo teams got was produce or else. And we all know how that story went. And there's been another interesting story also from banking this week about Revolut that you may have seen, that's also under scrutiny, about a very similar thing, setting aggressive targets at all costs and asking job interviewees to come to their interview with 200 signatures and sign-ups, before they're even working for the company, they're being set aggressive targets. It's not quite on the same scale as Wells Fargo, but Revolut, which is otherwise known as a really progressive, positive, disruptor bank, is not immune from this as well. So it sort of can happen to anyone. The next story we wanted to think about was VW, the VW crisis of 2017, where they were forced to come clean on their deceptively high-performing clean diesel engines. You may remember that in order to meet the US environmental regulations and achieve their very ambitious sales goals, their goal was actually to triple US sales within 10 years. VW designers were engineering software which basically was going to override the equipment when it was on a regulated test bed. So on the road, the cars were producing like 40 times the level of nitrous oxide permitted by regulation. But on the test bed, they could override it. And when this story first broke, it was thought that it was just particular to that engineering team. But when the scandal was investigated, they uncovered that actually the CEO, Martin Winterkorn, was in on it too. And he had a reputation for being arrogant, perfectionist, slave driver. These were some of the words that came out. And totally feared by his employees. You know, he modelled his leadership on a Chrysler executive, Ferdinand Piëch, who was also known, the quote is, to instigate a reign of terror and culture where performance was driven by fear and intimidation. So you can see it's a theme coming out, you know, fear-driven cultures get great performance to a point, but it can unravel very quickly. So fear lacks sort of long-term results, and it's just not sustainable ethical growth. Also, what's interesting about this story is the behavior that leaders role model doesn't just affect their own organizations, but it affects the industry as a whole. And then the final story that we wanted to bring to you is about Serono, which you may have come across from Silicon Valley. And it was one of the biggest scandals of the Bay Area that you may or may not have heard of, actually. You can see here the front cover of Inc. magazine. At its peak, she was being called the next Steve Jobs. She was 19 years old when she founded the company, and it was on a mission to find a much quicker, cheaper blood test that you could do at home that was going to uncover all sorts of illnesses, and at one point they were even talking about cancer. So, you know, a very compelling story. And the company at its peak had a record-breaking fundraise in Silicon Valley. So it was valued at $10 billion. It was raising $700 million in funds. It was really the darling of Silicon Valley. But again, it very quickly unraveled because soon reports came out that there wasn't actually a product. And when that was leaked, clearly it got investigated, and that was confirmed. They didn't actually have a product, which was a huge issue. So what the founder had been and the team had been focusing on was looking good publicly and getting that hype and working in service of shareholders over everything else. And Wired magazine did a really interesting article on this that you might want to check out, where they interviewed all sorts of people from across the team, the founders, funders, and they found the biggest problem of all was, to use their words, the dysfunctional corporate culture which was being developed. So any employee that challenged what was happening and the kind of lies and the hype was either marginalized or fired. Meanwhile, all the sycophants were promoted, and the company was wound down last year, and I'm not entirely sure it's that the 700 million fundraise, you know, made it back to its investors, but I don't think it did. So the point here again is, you know, the leaders who surround themselves by just yes people and looking good publicly rather than actually inviting healthy challenge. And, you know, again, no sector's immune. We see this in politics. This story was from hardware. We see it in tech. We see it in banking. So those are just some examples. We have many more, but we'll stop with the examples there for now.
Great. I can see we have a question from the audience. Should we just quickly check in?
Oh, interesting. So we've just had a comment that Google, that we mentioned on the Aristotle project, looking at team attributes, had a result that if they'd hired, a listener has just commented that if Google had perhaps hired psychologists over IT analysts and business types to sift through big data, they may have identified psychological safety as the main factor much quicker. That was a really interesting comment, and thank you for that. Keep them coming. Comments and questions, very welcome.
Yeah, and it sheds a lot of light, and we'll get into this in some of the ways that you actually cultivate psychological safety, but one of the big ways is inviting multiple perspectives, right? And that's a great example of multidisciplinary, teaming. And that's a very clear way in a business, if you're looking to hire somebody, and, it's the old example of if you've got one person if you're looking at two CVs and one on paper looks like an outstanding performer, but also looks like the same exact background as everybody else on your team, you might really want to consider actually credentials to what they're actually bringing to the table, and would it actually help the team to have some different kind of challenge over, whether they got a 2-1 or not 20 years before. So it's something to think about. Okay, so I think that we've banged on a lot about, psychological safety is everywhere. No organization can avoid it unless you happen to be an organization of robots, but even then, if there are any humans around, it's still quite difficult. So there may be some of you on the call who've experienced a major breakdown, like some of the ones that Abby went through. More than likely, you've probably experienced it in your day-to-day. So we're not going to do another poll or a hand raise again, but just consider for a moment, if you've ever been on a team where you wanted to speak up in a meeting, but you were worried that either you'd ask a stupid question or that there'd be consequences to you, disagreeing with somebody on the team. Or maybe you've in the past voiced a concern and were actively made to feel stupid or silly or laughed at or outcasted. If that's the case, you've probably experienced an environment with low psychological safety. On the flip, have you ever been in a team or maybe led a team where on the first day you invited new employees to ask all of their questions, silly or not silly, bring them all to the table? Have you ever heard, the expression in your team or your environment that, we work in the spirit of we got to break eggs to make omelets? Or have you ever been able to speak up with a different perspective, and even if your view wasn't taken, that it was acknowledged and you weren't punished or anything like that? If that's the case, then you've probably been in an environment with high psychological safety. The thing is with psychological safety, there are a lot of myths, and it's worth kind of stopping on what it is and what it isn't. Abby talked about so no matter what organization you're in, we've covered this cross-sector, cross-organization, but this is also, psychological safety makes a difference in complex environments. And Abby had talked about some drivers of businesses. So she talked about outperforming competitors in the Wells Fargo example. She talked about trying to beat the regulation or be able to both meet regulation as well as performance and running into trouble there. She talked about the drive to be first to market and be innovative. And all of these things are going to show up in our businesses in different ways regardless of the size. But some people seem to think that when we talk about psychological safety, that this is kind of this fluffy thing where it's all about being polite, doing lots of consultation, sitting in a room and navel-gazing to share your ideas, and that this is totally at odds with a high-performance culture. And frankly, that's just not the case. So I'd encourage you, don't be fooled by words like collaboration and openness. What we may struggle to count up in the numbers that we might in a more economic model, behavior is quite an irrational thing, and human dynamics are difficult. So when we're talking about psychological safety, these are some of the most difficult dynamics to cultivate if you're doing it right. So with psychological safety, it requires colleagues to be able to shift from this day-to-day politeness that we tend to see and being nice to one another and protecting one another's feelings to actually working in a more candid and respectful way. So that doesn't mean insulting people, but it does mean being able to give open and honest feedback, being able to share if you're not completely on board with the way the team is going, or with the way that a decision is going. And that takes a lot of courage. And if you're listening as an individual of how you contribute into your team versus if you're listening as a team leader, this can resonate at many different levels. Another thing to kind of point out about psychological safety, so some people ask, well, what's the difference with trust and psychological safety? As a shorthand, you can kind of say this is team trust. Technically speaking, Trust is more a dynamic between two people, whereas if you're in a group climate, when a new person enters the group, they'll quickly fall into line with whatever the norms of the group are. So psychological safety is basically that wrapper, that description of what it feels like to be in that team. And that connects directly to, it manifests from the beliefs that we have in our organization, which is called culture. Some people think, well, I'm an introvert, or I'm an extrovert, or I'm a whatever, so I can't talk, like this is not really for me. That's also a bit bogus, right? So anybody can learn behaviors to contribute in a healthy way and to be open to learning for themselves. And the bit about performance I think is really important is that most teams with high psychological safety tend to hold very high performance standards. So a lot of the times the other examples that we'll talk about a bit later on, these are all examples where it goes without saying that you come in as your best self, that you're coming into the organization with your A game, prepared to take accountability for how you contribute. You're committed to shared goals. You're committed to pushing yourself and the collective team to benefit from the greater good. So actually, where it's usually thought to be in conflict, these two things go hand in hand. And ultimately, for an individual, this means having the courage to sometimes be wrong, right? So this isn't about always getting your way or trying to prove somebody else right, but psychological safety sets the context for you being able to show up and have the courage to bring whatever you've got to the table for the benefit of the rest of the organization. And some of this also means sticking up for yourself as well, right? And some of the examples that you can see in the media have to do with Me Too movement and things like that. So having an environment where you actually can say where you think something's going wrong without having to go to the most extreme route of whistleblowing. So the key thing to remember here is that it's about embedding a learning mindset. So this is the opposite of a fear-driven environment, and that there's no silver bullet, but it's worth it. Because as we flip to the next slide, which covers some of the benefits. So we've borrowed this diagram from a website called Science for Work, which I highly recommend checking out, and it's in our resource section. Science for Work has loads of one-pagers, which are great that you can look at. And there's a really nice one on psych safety. So the key thing here around benefits is there are certain conditions that you need to cultivate psychological safety. Here you can see things like being clear on roles, being supportive, understanding how your role fits into to the organization, and being interdependent, and setting up this learning context. And what you stand to gain is that your employees and your teams and yourself are more open to sharing your information. Employees with high psychological safety environments report higher levels of satisfaction, higher levels of engagement, and higher degrees of learning behavior. So this is actually seeking out. So for instance, have you ever worked with another department where you think, well, they just don't know what they're talking about? But have you ever actually stopped to try and understand, well, what if I put myself in their shoes? What if I actually open myself up to understanding what they're saying and how they work, so we could find a way to best move forward together? And then ultimately, I think we've talked about performance. Looks like we've got a question.
Yeah, well, we've got a comment that I think is really, really nice to bring in at this point. So to whoever contributed that, thank you. Someone has just posted saying that they first learned formally about psychological safety from being a member of Toastmasters International. And apparently at each club and each meeting, they announced that this is a safe learning environment to learn how to be a better public speaker, and no one will be criticized by anyone in a negative manner. So I think that's a really great example. Thank you for that contribution. And we'll come on to a few more stories like that later.
So if this is a pretty easy concept to understand, then what holds, why don't we just do this? Why don't more organizations do it? And ultimately, this comes back to one of the BSB findings, that people are either crippled by fear of speaking up. So if I speak up, it's going to hurt my career, it's going to damage my reputation, so why bother? To be really worth it, because even if I say something, nobody's going to listen. And if you think about that, hopefully, hopefully and unfortunately, you'll probably resonate with those two scenarios. So how do we basically get past that? What do we do to bring it to life in your organization?
Thank you. So we can't really say that any one company has totally nailed it all the time, because that's just not how it works. But we have been, this is the kind of thing that we look at all the time and work with our clients on. And so we're hearing about great examples from all sorts of sectors about how people are tackling this. So we wanted to just bring you a few tangible examples of different organizations and what they're doing to start to cultivate this. And Google felt like a good place to start because they were one of the reasons that this has become so understood now. And something that Google does, they have a network of people across the whole company that they call canaries, which is based on the idea of canary in a coal mine, a signal that the canary in a coal mine used to be a signal that the oxygen was going to run out, and so the miners knew to go to the surface. So it's like a signal, or even a naysayer. And what Google did that I think was really smart was they sourced across the company people who were known for being a bit more negative, or perhaps naysayers, or challenging, cynics, or even dissenters for their opinions. And instead of trying to quieten down these people or to win them over and get them on side, what they did is give them the role. They became the canaries. And now, ahead of major releases or new initiatives, Google first of all sends it, they do all the typical user testing and that stuff, but they also send it to their network of canaries to invite challenging and different divergent views. And I think that's really interesting because it gives them a specific role, and it gives them a stated role. So it's saying, we appreciate your different view, and please keep bringing it. The second example there on the right of the screen is that's about Bridgewater Capital, and Bridgewater is a very extreme organization that embodies a lot of what we're talking about today. They take the challenge and telling truth and honesty to new levels in something that's typically called radical candor, which is being very open and honest in real time with each other. At Bridgewater, what's going on in this cartoon is that they record every single meeting. So they make decision-making completely open and transparent, so you know why decisions are being made, by whom challenged it, and you're invited to challenge. So Bridgewater is quite extreme on the spectrum of embodying different, or doing different techniques that create psychological safety, but then you can see it in their performance. They're one of the world's largest hedge funds, so there's a lesson for us all there. One example that we love is from Nationwide Building Society. We heard recently that the ExCo hears from their frontline staff every Monday about what's not going well. So every Monday, anyone from frontline staff can book a slot with this ExCo panel to tell them about the challenges they're facing in the work, and then ExCo will commit to fixing that. And what I love about this is it makes it non-emotional and routine, and it also gives a great signal from the ExCo that it's a priority. It's the first thing they do on a Monday, and they want to invite those different views, invite challenge, invite what's not working, and work together to fix it. So it's giving that permission for people to speak up, and they will listen and they will take action as well, which is very important. And finally, from a slightly different sector, from aviation, I love this example, and we're hearing more and more about people from banking, financial services, speaking to people from sectors like aviation, healthcare, because they're very high-risk industries both. Aviation has a really interesting practice where any error that happens in flight is written up and then published industry-wide for the whole industry to learn from. And it's that sort of how do you deal with problems or failures or mistakes? How do you deal with them publicly? What do you do with that information? And turning errors and mistakes into something that is a learning priority, I think, is really useful and really interesting.
Yeah. So I think it's a really great point, and you can see that particularly with aviation, what they've done well, they've had a while to work on this, right? Because they had some death tolls that were on the rise, And it wasn't until the whole industry actually pulled together that they were able to make some progress. So you can see it's a bit of a domino effect. Once the industry starts to band together to share and have a safety in itself, then the whole industry moves forward, which is a great example. We had one question around, do you feel the momentum and weight and support for promoting psychological safety and change of culture within FS has been significantly impacted by recent scandals? Absolutely. Yes, that's why we're talking about it today. But still, we see in not just the banking sector, but financial services overall, there's such a distal impact. So aviation, if something goes wrong, plane goes down, people die. Mm-hmm. In the medical field, if a surgeon messes up and there's not good communication in the operating theater, something happens, people die. In financial services, if there's a major scandal or there's bad mortgages or something like that happening, it's not until years down the line that somebody, a consumer, might actually uncover that impact, right? So there's distal impact. So it allows all of the firms within the sector to remain competitive with each other instead of pulling together, which we are starting to see more now. What I'm curious about, we'll get to the second half of the question in a second. I'm curious though, Abby, because you work with really interesting organizations at Bring. So how do you actually tackle this at Bring?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. So when we're working across government, corporate, you're right, a whole range of sectors. And the things that we try, and instill in our work and our practices are sometimes it's really small stuff like using words very carefully. So I think the word of failure, if you have an initiative that fails, the word failure is quite emotive and highly emotional and has pretty negative connotations. Whereas we use more the language of learning. Often we even use the language of the hypothesis, and it's you've disproven a hypothesis. If you had an idea in mind, you made a hypothesis about it, you tested that hypothesis and it didn't work, then that's not an epic failure, that's a disproven hypothesis. And we try and keep it much more sort of science-based, right, than a highly personal and emotional words like failure. And we also talk about creating the imperative, not the permission to experiment. So it's one thing to say we give our employees permission to try things, make mistakes. It's a very different thing to make that an imperative, like how much are you allowing time for employees to experiment and learn. If you're learning, then an experiment. Hi, we're back. It's Abby and Nicole again. We cut out for some reason, so apologies for that. Just to double check, Anna, can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you now. Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Hello, we're here. I don't know if you, I'm not sure why you can't hear us.
I can hear you.
Oh, you can?
I can.
Okay. Sorry for the technical disruption. So we're just saying, in the same way that organizations need to kind of plan to experiment, the same thing comes up when I'm coaching leaders, right? The same thing about actually not being so afraid of failure that you won't try, but actually saying, actually there are a few ways that I can approach this and test this. For instance, putting feelers out for a new job. Yeah. Just putting your feelers out doesn't mean that you're leaving the company or that you've accepted a new job, or, there's ways to break down some of the problems which can reduce the fear and allow for more learning. So what should people be thinking about?
Yeah, and sorry, the formatting's gone a little bit interesting on the slide as we uploaded it, but I think you can still read the words. So we saw from the registration list that in our audience, we've got quite a mix of people from frontline staff through to managers and some C-suite as well, and everything in between. So that's really great to understand that we've got sort of full spectrum across organizations listening in and on the call today. So we thought with that in mind, for anyone within an organization, what should you be thinking about? And we've touched on this already, right? But how do you treat good news versus bad news as a leader, as a team, as an organization? Whatever your unit of measurement happens to be. That's really important because we all are great at dealing with good news, but it's most importantly, how do we deal with bad news? Does the energy go up and everyone rallies around to help try and fix it, or does it become a kind of finger-pointing scapegoat scenario where no one can bring bad news because they're turned into a scapegoat and possibly fired? So that I think sounds simple, and it is, but it's a huge one. In the boardroom, in the meeting room, in performance reviews, everywhere. How do you welcome and treat bad news? And good news too. Hey, we all like that. Next up is how do you reward experimentation over outcomes? So to what we were just saying, experimentation is a process. If people are going to learn new things, try new things, try new ways of working, launch new products, test new customer propositions, whatever it may be, how do you support them to try in a safe space and perhaps fail? How do you reward that experimentation over outcomes? So that typically is in incentive structures, in performance reviews, and also in having a language for it. Next up is what's your culture towards failure in tangible terms? So we heard about in aviation, they talk about mistakes and they publicize that in the log. I love the story of an insurance company called Simply Business, where every Friday they have a kind of mini failure fest where the CEO brings donuts and they publicly celebrate anyone that's had a failure that week because it means they've tried and experimented. Obviously, in regulated industries, that becomes more challenging, but it's still that culture of being able to openly talk about it, share what happened, learn from it as an organization, and move on in a positive way. And finally, to what extent do you allow the norms in the industry to drive the culture in your own organization? So we're hearing in the comments about some of the practices from the C-suite, and that we read about that in the press all the time. But what's your role in your individual organization for bucking the norm, bucking the trend, and creating your own culture that is specific to your organization and suits your customers, your products, and your workforce?
So I want to make sure that we come back to the other half of the question. Oh, wow, the formatting's really gone right here. Could you pull up the second half of the question as we're talking through this? So what does that mean for today, right? We've talked about some things, and probably, if you've got a large responsibility in an organization, it can feel like you need to do a whole other initiative, and that's not really what we're suggesting. So I'll mention a few things here. I just want to read out this question. Great at me answer. So how can employees, so based on all of the scandal that's gone on in financial services, how can employees feel safe to speak up and challenge the authority when regulators appear reluctant to make an example out of senior executives? And that, thank you for asking that question. I think like that's the question, right? Like how do we even do this if it's not just within firms, right? It's not just any one individual, it's not any one team, it's not any one firm, it's not any one regulator. This is a problem that is influenced at so many levels in the broader system or the broader ecosystem. So I'm not going to speak on behalf of any regulator or anything like that, but I think what it means is that you have to start within your sphere of influence, right? So what we've got here, and the idea isn't to attain psychological safety as a milestone, right? Behavior is constantly changing and it's complex. So we need to start small and start where we can to first understand, well, where are you already at? Where are you at as an individual? If you're in a team, how does it feel to be in that team? If you're a team leader or you're a manager, how are you actually, and I'll come on to some of these examples, how are you inviting this environment to come to be? And if you're a leader, how are you role modeling this behavior? So there are lots of different ways to kind of think about it, but everybody has a role to play in this. So if you're on the phone thinking, well, I'm just an employee, I don't have any management responsibility, so it's for my leaders to do this, that's not the case at all. So one of the first things to think about is, and these all come from Amy Edmondson's recent book, The Fearless Organization, with also some interesting insights from Jennifer Garvey Berger, who's also just put out an interesting book on mind traps, leadership mind traps. So the first thing is about framing work as a learning problem, not an execution problem. So this is exactly what Abby was talking about when it comes to breaks. So make it part of the process to learn from this and not just be about delivering the end product. Of course, we want to deliver the end product, but we also want to learn how to do that better and how to do that differently. And when it doesn't work, that's not the point to just run away, but it's the point to actually get really curious and dig in about, well, what happened there? And what do we need to change in how we're doing things to avoid that? So this is about encouraging learning. A quick example of that, when I first started as a grad in consulting many years ago now, I remember sitting at the table with the team and all of these managers and them saying, Nicole, what do you think we should do for this client? And it was 3 weeks on the job, and I just looked him in the eye and said, why are you asking me? I've just graduated from uni. I know nothing. Like, you're supposed to be teaching me. Why are you asking me this? And it took him a while to get through to me, but he took that learning moment and said, it is really important to hear your ideas and your perspectives, because we've been on this project now for 2 years, and there might be something that we're missing. So he, a person with many, many, many more years experience, invited me to contribute what I came to the table with and told me that that was valuable. That made every difference. I became a high performer at the firm. I did all these kinds of things because he gave me that space to try and to contribute. In terms of rewarding thoughtful failure, so a lot of times this one gets a little bit misperceived, right? People think that this is about, oh, everybody fails and we all celebrate. No, this is about, in teams, having a way that we fail, right? Trying. And, for some organizations and different teams at Google, what they say is try methodically, test things. And when you finally get to the point where you've just disproven the main hypothesis and there's nowhere to go forward, then it's okay to say, all right, we've put in a good effort here. Let's acknowledge that effort and let's move on to the next thing. Second bit is about acknowledging your own failability. Everybody can do this. This is about self-awareness, and instead of asking yourself questions such as, how can I prove that I'm right? Asking yourself questions about how can I be wrong in this situation? Or inviting multiple perspectives. So sometimes that's bringing in a third party to be able to kind of hold up the mirror and reflect back, what they're seeing in the organization and work with you on that. Sometimes that's actually you just looking at yourself and being a bit honest about the feedback you might be getting or what's actually coming up for you. But it's about practicing humility. And coaching skills can come in really handy here as well, whether you're teaching them in your organization for HR practitioners and the like, or whether you're actually getting coached is a really good process. Of course, I would say that I'm a coach, but I do believe that. And lastly, it's modeling curiosity. So, and I think actually this is one for leaders that you really need to pay attention about. It's about, we tend to ask the same kinds of questions, and therefore we get the same kinds of answers. So be mindful. Try to actually observe in the next day or the next week what kind of questions you're asking your team and your organization. Try to ask more open questions. Ask people that you wouldn't normally for their perspective, no matter what level or what place they are in the organization. And start to open yourself up to looking for patterns. How do we actually do things here? How aware are you of that? And also, what are the patterns in my own way of thinking that might be influencing how I'm behaving? We could talk about this for hours, but I'm mindful of time. So those are some ideas to take forward. I don't know if we have any more questions
Yeah, so if you have any questions in the last few minutes remaining, please post them now, questions or comments or feedback in the feedback section. While you're doing that, just a few things that we wanted to bring to your attention. This is what Nicole and I work on all the time. We love psychological safety. We hope that you've sort of enjoyed either learning about it from the start, from the top today, or sort of building on your knowledge. And so in the attachments and links section, we've put a resource with further reading, with a couple of podcasts if you want to dig in on that level. And we also have a web page you can follow there to get some more information. We offer from time to time diagnostics and workshops coming into your organization, working either on a team level or a division or with the whole organization, to sort of look at what's going on now and where do you want to get to, and then putting in place some really tangible ways to start cultivating that practice, right? Like Nicole said, it's not a silver bullet. It's not like we do one workshop and you're fixed. It's more like how can we start to cultivate practices that are right for your organization? So if that sounds interesting, come and chat to us. And we also have a masterclass in the diary on the 26th of April. That's a full day. It's a deeper dive alongside a few other financial services organizations and other high-risk, similar highly regulated high-risk industries, where we'll be spending the day really digging into this stuff. So looking at what does it mean for your organization, how do you measure it, and how do you tackle it? And so you'll come away from that day with some very practical tools and tips and techniques. Yeah. And then finally, something we just wanted to mention is one of the ways we work. We bring together cohorts of 4 or 5 companies. We're doing this with the retail sector, and we have another. We run sort of quarterly what we call sprints, which is to come together around the challenge topics. So the challenge could be, how might we cultivate a better speak up and listen up culture? We bring a very small number of curated organizations together, and we look at ways to sort of sprint through different ideas for tackling that problem together. So we have a couple of spots left on that, one sprint starting in June, another in September. So you can get our contact details from the resources. You can click links to sign up to the events. And yeah, we have some feedback coming in from the audience. Very kind feedback. Thank you very much. And so I think as we don't have any more questions, Anna, unless there's anything else from you.
No, I would just like to thank you both and thank you for our listeners as well. If you're a member of the Chartered Banking Institute, you can log this webinar as CPD, so please be sure to do so. I just wanted to say thank you to you both.
Thank you very much for hosting us. We've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great afternoon, everybody, or wherever you are.
Thank you very much.
Bye.